tonight we're not just talking about a woman, but we're also talking about a scientist, which is I wanted to choose people from different areas, and I think this is, so it's really interesting choosing her and seeing what she's actually done. I'm just curious, you mentioned you don't know anything about her, presumably because she's not from Russia or Ukraine or that part of the world. Does anyone else know anything about her? Have you heard of Rosalind Franklin? What is it that you've heard about her?
I know she was not recognised for her part in the DNA research.
That's right.
Only Watson and Crick got it, and it was only, as far as I remember, about 20 years ago that her name started to be talked about, and I've seen a plaque to her in Cambridge.
Really?
Her name on it.
In maybe...
With what? In Cambridge.
King's probably rather than Cambridge, but yes, okay.
No, because Watson and Crick have got a memorial plate in a pub in Cambridge.
That's right.
And she's been put up beside them.
Has she? Oh, okay, yes. Right, that's interesting. Okay, excellent, and we'll touch on all that. So there's a controversy around her, which is mostly what people know about her, something to do with DNA. But actually, anyone know anything else about her? Sorry, I should say. No.
She took the critical photograph, that's all I know.
That's right.
Photograph 51, was it?
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
That's what I remember.
You know what? That's not the most important reason. Okay. We personally should be really grateful for her. Does anyone know why that is? Why this particular, not just us, everyone in Britain and in the world, in fact, but only the last couple of years we should be particularly grateful.
COVID?
Something to do with COVID, yes?
Viruses, yeah.
Yeah, she did the initial research on RNA, which is another form of it. Without her initial research, we wouldn't have the vaccine here today. Wow. So, and she's an astonishing person. I'm going to try to give you a real overview of her life. I'm also going to try to explain her science, or just some of it actually, obviously. So let me start off with the overview. So, internationally renowned English chemist and an X-ray crystallographer. I will explain what all that means. So her work was essential to the understanding of the molecular structures of DNA, of RNA, of viruses, coal and graphite. She only lived 37 years, but she published widely, about 40 papers, many technically remarkable, and she sole authored a lot of them. Now, she was a brilliant experimentalist. Oops, let me just click on this. Yeah. And she took this key photograph that Michael mentioned. This is the clue to the meaning of life, really, in many ways. It's called photograph 51 because it was the 51 in the series. It took over 40 hours to develop. It was taken at such slow motion. And this reveals that DNA is made up in a double helix structure. Again, I will explain this. So it's providing the data to solve much of the problem, to solve how is life constructed. So this is one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century. But her efforts were not widely recognized. 10 years after she died, she became a feminist icon when James Watson, another scientist who you mentioned who did win the prize, he published a book called The Double Helix, and he heavily criticized her in this book. He only had met her a few times. So she was seen by some as the doomed woman whose gifts were sacrificed to the greater glory of the male. And then feminists wrote books about her, describing how she was hard done by and so forth. Now, much of this is a myth, actually. She saw herself as a scientist rather than as a pioneering woman, but I will tell you the story. So what was she like? She was utterly dedicated, but quite prickly. She only had a few close friends. She didn't find life easy, and many didn't find her easy either. For 2 years, she was involved in one of the great personal quarrels of science and was often isolated, both emotionally and intellectually. And she was treated unfairly, for sure. But it was maybe in her very DNA that determined that she had to have a row with people. Which is a kind of a perverse thing, really. What's more, that short period of her life is not her major legacy. She did fantastic science regardless of the obstacles in the way. Okay, so let me backtrack. And the picture on the left is the earliest one of her. And the one on the right is with her sister, Jennifer. So she was born Rosalind Elsie Franklin. What amazing names to call your kid, eh? Rosalind Elsie. 25th of July, 1920 in Notting Hill in London, to an affluent, well-established British Jewish family. Her father was Ellis Arthur Franklin, who had an OBE, and was a politically liberal merchant banker, the patriarch of the family. He was large, intelligent, successful, witty, and overbearing. Her mother was Muriel Frances Whaley, who was well-educated, strong-minded, warm, sociable, a natural leader of any charity commission. Now, her maternal grandfather was Jacob Whaley, and he helped found the United Synagogue. She's going to help found, by the way, New London Synagogue, the Masorti one. On the father's side, Franklin's paternal great-grandfather was Ellis Abraham Franklin. He was a partner at the bank, Samuel Montague, and brother-in-law of Lord Swathling. Franklin's great-uncle was Herbert Samuel. You come across him? Know who he was?
Yeah, yeah.
What do you know? What do you know about Herbert Samuel?
He's a politician.
Yes. He's got a unique thing as a politician.
Oh,
He was liberal, wasn't he?
He was liberal. That's not unique.
was he a big Zionist?
He was a big Zionist. He was also the first practicing Jew to serve in the British government, in the British cabinet. He was Home Secretary. And what did he become later? What was he after he
Got a
left the cabinet?
peerage. He got a peerage, didn't he?
Yeah. What was his job though? You know, he became the first High Commissioner for the British Mandate in Palestine. Her paternal grandfather was Arthur Ellis Franklin, who was chairman of the Routledge publishing firm, president of the Jewish Religious Board, co-founder of New West End Synagogue, and senior partner at the bank Keyser and Kolsch. So they were part of the cousinhood, you can call them, the British aristocracy, Jewish aristocracy. She was the elder daughter and second child of 5, and you can see them here: David, Colin, Roland, and Jennifer. They had a nanny, Ada Griffiths, who the children were close to. In fact, they probably saw more of her than their mother. Much of Franklin's extended family lived nearby. They were philanthropic. They had strongly developed social consciences and liberal views. So Franklin's uncle, Hugh, once attempted to strike the Home Secretary on a train in 1910 with a dog whip. Any idea who the Home Secretary was at the time? How good's your history?
Israel, I don't know.
Excuse me? No idea. No. British. Any idea? No. He was Winston Churchill.
Oh no.
Churchill was unharmed, but Hugh was imprisoned for several months. Arthur, her father, taught electricity, magnetism, and the history of the Great War at the Working Men's College in the evenings. This is it's a college for people who are working. It's a voluntary thing. It's it's extremely philanthropic thing that he did in that way. He became its bursar and vice principal. He also helped settle Jewish refugees from Europe who had escaped from Nazis. So she had an upper middle class childhood with school and pets, excuse me, long lunches with opinionated conversations. They were expected to argue at the dinner table. They had servants, had country weekends with her grandfather. Muriel, her mother, ensured that the daughters were as well educated as the sons. And they were, so she was quite a stormy child, however. She was easily roused to tears and anger, and frequently felt that she was treated unfairly in relation to her brothers. She was also precociously intelligent. She liked memory games. She had exceptional scholastic ability. When she was 6, her aunt wrote, "Rosalind is alarmingly clever. She spends all her time doing arithmetic for pleasure and invariably gets her sums right." Whilst her mother wrote, "As a tiny child, she could never accept a belief or statement for which no reason or proof could be produced." So it sums up this idea. I bet she was always asking why. Age 9, when Jennifer was born, she was sent to a boarding school in Bexhill, the Lindor's School for Young Ladies. Being near the seaside was thought to be good for her health, but she was homesick and didn't like it there. She distracted herself by striving to be top of the class. There was a measure each week for that. She stayed there for 2 years. Aged 11, she won a scholarship to St. Paul's in Hammersmith. And this is one of the few girls' schools in the country at the time that taught physics and chemistry. So she thrived in this competitive school. She topped her class, she became fluent in French, and she won a prize each year. So she wasn't a team player. She was often hostile and indifferent, both at home and school, scornful of her father's conservative views, and she scolded her mother on her supposedly dull life. You could be getting a picture of her, can't you, this little kid. She was frequently in trouble with teachers and anxious about the marks that she scored. Also fascinated with developing photographs, even at this early age, and her grandparents built her a darkroom in the shed in their garden. Age 16, she started working for the higher school certificate, and she studied chemistry and physics and maths. She decided she wanted to be a scientist when she was 12. Teaching, however, wasn't that exciting. Franklin had high standards for herself and did extra work on her own. She got 6 distinctions out of 6, won an externally assessed scholarship for university, but on her father's suggestion, she donated the scholarship to a needy refugee student. I think this was very typical of the family, actually. They would look out for people less well off themselves.
Charitable.
Yeah, very. She applied to Newnham College, Cambridge, in 1938, a year earlier than she should have done for her age. And she doubted her ability, but despite all this, she came first in the examination for chemistry across the university. At Cambridge, she basically worked long hours. She made few close friends. Maybe that really wasn't her thing, making close friends. She was always ready to argue vehemently, and her supervisor's report said she does not seem to take criticism kindly. Very British way of putting it, isn't it? She never would take criticism kindly throughout the rest of her career. These are actually pictures of her notebooks at the time. She's taking notes during lectures. And this is a picture of explaining Xray crystallography. I'll touch on it later. You probably understand it clearly without me needing to do that. No, it's fine, I won't bother. 1941, she was awarded an upper second class, so a 2-1, which was a failure for her. It was the first time she hadn't got a first. However, in the physical chemistry exam, she did come top in the university. She probably didn't get a first overall. She was nervous, I guess. Despite this, she was awarded a research fellowship at Newnham and a research grant from the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, where she worked under this guy, Ronald Norrish. Now, he was a heavy drinker, I think you can tell from his photograph, and he couldn't decide what work she should do. He was also hostile to female scientists and people who disagreed with him. So you can imagine it was not a marriage made in, or partnership made in heaven, this one.
I know a few people like that.
Yes, exactly, we all do, don't we? Yeah. The project she was assigned to work with him on was going badly, and Franklin spotted a fundamental error in its design. So she didn't hold back. She confronted him and had what she later called a first-class row, which things blew up. She wrote that she despised him completely, and he was stupid, bigoted, deceitful, ill-mannered, and tyrannical. So that's her view of him.
Nice guy.
Yeah. You would think from this he was a complete washout. He won the Nobel Prize in 1967, this guy, by the way. But, anyway. But she was achieving little with him, and she resigned after a year. We're in the second time she's failed, really. We're in the middle of the war at this point, so she had to do some sort of national service, and she really struggled to get something that she could do in her field. But in the end, she worked as an assistant research officer at the British Coal Utilisation Research Association. She was basically investigating the effects of coal dust, which were used hugely, by the way, very practical, the use of gas masks. So how porous they had to be to stop the gas coming in. And this formed the basis of her PhD thesis. Now, during the war, I was delighted to discover that her parents rented a house in Radlett. And in fact, I happened to speak with her sister by chance, a long story, and she told me that they lived in the same road that I live in currently. She told me the name of the house, but I can't track it down. So I need to get some old maps about that. But what a coincidence, eh? She didn't live there. She, after leaving Cambridge, she lived with her cousin Irene near Putney, and they volunteered together as air raid wardens, and they regularly made hazardous patrols across the common in the dark during air raids. Now, after the war, she asked a friend, Adrienne Weil, to let her know of job openings. Again, she was struggling to find something. And this led to her appointment working for Jacques Mehring at his laboratory in Paris. So this is a picture of her, actually, it's a tradition apparently, after lunch you serve coffee in these crucibles. So she was appointed one of 15 researchers, and she was expecting to stay a year or two, but in fact stayed for 4. And Mehring taught her the practical aspects of applying X-ray crystallography to amorphous substances. He described her as the best ever student. She was brilliant, hungry to learn, incredibly dexterous in her research techniques, and ingenious in experimental design. It seems to be she either got on with these male scientists or she didn't, and therefore it was either a great success or it was a disaster. So she was Marmite, really. Now, she was working on X-ray crystallography, as I've said, and she applied it to coal. Now, these are 3 different types of carbon: graphite, diamond, and fullerene. And you can see the molecular structure is different for each of them. In fact, that's what defines what they are. It's the way that the atoms are arranged which determines whether they become graphite, diamond, or fullerene, or whatever else is there. Now, the microscopes aren't powerful enough to see the formation of the atoms. So they needed a different way of identifying what it was. And that's where X-ray crystallography comes in. Basically, you shine an X-ray at something, and this is zinc sulfide. So you can see when it's really blown up, it looks like it is on the left. It's got these cube type shapes, zinc sulfide. And if you put a X-ray at it, it'll come out on the screen with these blobs on the right hand. And you can see it's a square. And by looking at it and doing lots of maths, if you're very skilled, you can work out that it's a cube. So that was her job. And the key to it was getting really clear photographs, which was not a trivial matter because the equipment in those days was pretty grim, really. And there wasn't isolation in a scientific atmosphere. So this is what she worked on, and she developed her skills. She also spoke perfect French there, was totally committed to her work. There were quite a few women in the laboratory. They were all treated as equals and without condescension. So she loved this life. It was post-war, it was Spartan, it was classless, it was intellectual. She was really reluctant to return to London, but she felt she had to in order to reintegrate into the British scientific community. But frankly, she wasn't enthusiastic about the move. She found London mediocre and class-riven. So she had a clipped accent, sort of a BBC London accent, and that marked her out from most of her middle-class colleagues, really. But she won a 3-year fellowship to King's at £750 a year. At that point, King's women were excluded from the senior common room at King's. And it was a very different atmosphere to the friendly and welcoming one she was used to in Paris. She felt insulted there. There were other women there. There were very few Jews, by the way, and all foreigners, so it was clearly a typical British place. But there were other women. And in January 1951, she started working as a research associate in the Medical Research Council's biophysics unit, led by this guy, John Randall. And she was appointed to work on the X-ray diffraction, so using this technique, of proteins and lipids in solution. So a new area they wanted to get involved in. So she got that job, fine. But before she started working, Randall, the director, redirected her to work on DNA fibers, as she was the only experienced experimental diffraction researcher in the group. There already were other people working in this area, and in particular, Maurice Wilkins and Raymond Gosling. Now, Maurice Wilkins was the associate director of the group, so Randall's number 2. Gosling was his PhD student. And they had very crude photographic equipment, but they'd managed to do some pioneering X-ray diffraction of DNA for a year or so. So it was their field. Randall, the boss, didn't tell them that he was asking Franklin to take over both the DNA diffraction work and the guidance of Gosling's PhD. So Wilkins, he was Franklin's superior. So he had thought that she would be his assistant. Instead, the better trained Franklin took over his laboratory, his work, and his assistant. And that's the cause of a lot of the trouble. There's no need to walk out just because it's that he did that bad thing, you know, it's a bit of an overreaction. When she joined, she made a really strong impression on her colleagues. So they described her as very attractive, very bright, very impatient, and very opinionated. And I think all but one of those are not meant as compliments. She had published widely and was a world expert in her field, but this was graphite, this was coal. In this new area, which was essentially medicine, you could argue, she didn't have a reputation at all. And they treated her in that way. So she felt undervalued and that her work wasn't being taken seriously. So she rapidly became unhappy and isolated there. She used a new fine focus X-ray and micro camera, which Wilkins had ordered, but she commandeered it when he was on holiday, and she refined it and adjusted it and focused it. And particularly, she skillfully manipulated the critical hydration of the specimens, how wet they were, basically. And that significantly improved the quality of the photographs that have been achieved. And so she produced some astonishingly clear photographs, and that revealed that there were two forms of DNA. Stop me if it's not making clear. So two different forms of DNA. When it was very humid, the DNA fiber became long and thin, and when it dried out, it became short and fat. And Franklin named these two forms the B form and the A form.
That's my phone. Sorry.
So all previous attempts to understand the structure of DNA had failed because they'd been looking at a blur of these two different forms, which is why they got stuck. So it really was the breakthrough. That's why that photo 51 is so crucial. So she was part of this group, and Wilkins suggested that they collaborate in exploring this finding. But she had just achieved extraordinary results by working in virtual isolation while people were a bit nasty to her. So now she saw a less able colleague of higher rank trying to elbow in and take credit for her work. And she couldn't abide him. And she rebuffed his attempts to join forces and treated him with scorn. She was kind of an in-your-face woman. She said it as it was. Remember, her father was quite an assertive guy, and she was used to at a dinner table saying it as it was. In fact, if it wasn't an argument, it wasn't a proper dinner. He was a really introverted guy who'd just gone through a terrible divorce. Apparently he never gave anyone ever any eye contact. He'd look at you and talk like this, that's side on. So they couldn't find any point of touching. Communication between the two of them virtually ceased. Wilkins felt shut out from his own subject, and his difficulties with Franklin became something of an obsession. Now, she was on a research grant, so she had to present her findings regularly to the panel which determined whether the grant would continue. And she presented her findings at a lecture at King's on the 21st of November 1951. And James Watson, guy here, he's from Cambridge University. He was in the lecture. He was a typical arrogant Cambridge person. I'm saying that as I went to Cambridge. He heard a lecture and failed to take any notes, just kind of scribbled something down on his newspaper on the train back to Cambridge. But with Crick, he built a practical model of the three-chain helical model of DNA. So they tried to guess what it would look like. They showed this to Franklin, and she was cutting. She immediately spotted a flaw in the model as it didn't contain enough water. This was the critical thing, if you remember, in the photographs. So Watson and Crick were told to stop working on their model. This is 1951. Franklin carried on her research, but she was disillusioned with the way the lab was working and dismissive of her colleagues. She says, "There isn't a first class or even a good brain among them. In fact, nobody with whom I particularly want to discuss anything, scientific or otherwise. And I so much prefer to work under somebody who commands my respect and can offer some encouragement." so she was isolated. Now at King's, it was generally accepted that the B form of the DNA was a helix, so a curly thing. But she had recorded an asymmetric image in May 1952, and she was unconvinced that the A form was also helical. She insisted that she needed solid proof. In fact, she famously, with Gosling, put this death notice up on the notice board of King's. It says, "It is with great regret that we have to announce the death on Friday, 18th of July, of DNA helix crystalline. Death followed a protracted illness with an intensive course of desalinized injections has failed to relieve. A memorial service will be held next Monday." It is noted that Wilkins was
Tuesday
of the late. Sorry, Michael. Yeah, you can sit. So you can see there is friendly rivalry at best. Wilkins did not have a sense of humour and was completely wound up by this. It must be said also that she was pretty much on her own in holding this view that it wasn't helical, and others were pretty condescending towards her. Late 1952, an American scientist is working on this. He's Linus Pauling. There's a lot of competition going on between universities. This is the key scientific thing at the time. Who is going to decode DNA? And everyone wants the glory. Linus Pauling, he proposed a model for DNA structure, and he's a very famous biochemist. He's going to win the Nobel Prize, not for DNA, but for something else in a couple of years. And it contains the same mistake that Watson and Crick had made. But everyone's worried because Pauling's son is researching in Cambridge, and he will pass back to his dad the mistake that's been made, and he'll sort it quite quickly. So on 30th of January 1953, Watson went to Franklin's lab seeking an urgent collaboration in order to stop Pauling discovering his error. And Watson told her they had to work together because she was incompetent in interpreting X-ray pictures. You can imagine how that went down, can't you? Apparently, according to Watson, Franklin was outraged, and Watson claimed that she physically advanced towards him, and he retreated from her, fearing that she would hit him. Now, he, by the way, was twice her size. She'd never hit anything in her life, so there's a bit of poetic license here. But Watson, running out of his office, probably getting a scolding, bumped into Wilkins in the corridor. And Wilkins commiserated with him, and at that point, he showed Watson photo 51. So this had been within King's up to this point. And Watson immediately realized that this molecule was a helix, and says, "The instant I saw the picture, my mouth fell open and my pulse began to race." So he went back to Cambridge, and in an attempt to forestall Pauling, he and Crick started to build a molecular model of the B form of DNA on the 4th of February 1953. Now, a few days later, Crick obtained a copy of a report written for a Medical Research Council Biophysics Committee visit to King's in December 1952. Now, this contained all Franklin's crystallographic calculations. She had to present this report because they were funding her. But it was kind of her research, her material. And really, it should have been confidential to her, or at least if it was going to be shared, it should have been done openly. It so happened that the person on the MRC Council who had to agree her work happened to be Watson and Crick's boss. So he gave them this information. And this was the crucial information, because they were not the nitty-gritty scientists that she was. Unknowingly, she had provided the essential data for others who took the leap of intuition needed to solve the puzzle of DNA. Franklin herself was opposed to building theoretical models. She wanted to show that sufficient data was there to properly prove it, and that could guide model building. So she was not a theoretician. So Einstein was a theoretician, for example. He didn't have any data, he just dreamt up stuff, and so were these two. By the end of February, she had reconciled all her conflicting data, and she had concluded that in fact both forms of DNA were two-chain helices. The two groups were working independently at this point. On the 28th of February, Watson and Crick felt they had solved the problem enough. And this is the story you told. Crick went to the pub and he said, in the Eagle, and he said to people, "I discovered the secret of life." But it wasn't he that did it at all. It was Franklin who provided the data. He'd made the leap of intuition to build a model about it. She knew nothing about this at the time. Instead, she independently writes 3 papers, 2 of which include a double helical DNA backbone. And these manuscripts reached the journal on the 6th of March, 1953. Watson and Crick finished building their model on the 7th of March, 1 day later. So she independently had done all this. On the 8th of March, Watson and Crick receive a letter from Wilkins saying that Rosalind is leaving King's. So Wilkins goes to see the model the next week, and he tells Gosling about it when he gets back. Now, it's unclear how long it took Gosling to tell Franklin about it, but her 17th of March manuscript doesn't reflect any knowledge of this Cambridge model. So why I've given you all those dates is that, in all probability, although the famous article in Nature was published on April and was under the name of Crick and Watson, she had probably done independent work to get to that point herself. In this particular one, in the initial article, all that Crick and Watson say is that they were stimulated by general knowledge of Franklin and Wilkins' unpublished contribution. This was as a result of a deal struck between the 2 lab heads, who were more concerned to stitch up America, actually, than to between them. So the idea was that Crick and Watson had the first article, and then Wilkins and Franklin had the subsequent ones, seemingly only in support of Crick and Watson's paper. But the reality was that Franklin's work was totally fundamental, and she had not been consulted on its use. She never knew they had seen her photographs and her data. She died without knowing that. In reality, it took Wilkins and his colleagues 7 years to collect enough data to refine and confirm the DNA structure, although the model wasn't decisively proved until 25 years later. That's again very similar to how lots of physics work. So CERN in Switzerland is only now proving some of Einstein's ideas. But in 1962, the Nobel Prize was awarded to Crick, Watson, and Wilkins. Neither Watson nor Crick mentioned Franklin at all in their Nobel Prize acceptance speeches. Meanwhile, desperately unhappy at King's, Franklin approached John Desmond Bernal at Birkbeck College and asked to join his biological group. She'd only worked at King's for less than 2 years. Her office, she was accepted at Birkbeck, her office on the 5th floor used to be a maid's room. It was in a crumbling Georgian building in Torrington Square, reached by a narrow staircase. The ceiling skylight leaked. The X-ray equipment was in a basement, so it was completely different to King's, but she had 5 very happy and very productive years there. It was like being back in France, really. There's a really good collegiate atmosphere. She also had good relationships with Bernal. At the end of 1954, he secured funding for her from the Agricultural Research Council, which enabled her to work as a senior scientist, supervising her own research group. And she used X-ray crystallography excuse me, to study the structure of the tobacco mosaic virus, which is an RNA virus, the same as coronavirus. And she decoded the first three-dimensional structure of any virus. Actually, TMV, it's used because it's very common, and it's actually harder to solve than DNA. So she found it much more satisfying. She never regretted the move. She was a purist. For her, the glory was nothing. It was the intellectual challenge. So her methodology has subsequently been used to uncover the structure of numerous other viruses, including the COVID-19 coronavirus. She made a 2-month trip to the US, giving lectures and making contacts in virus laboratories, which formed the basis for much of her work over the next 3 years. And her meeting with Aaron Klug in early 1954 led to a long-standing and successful collaboration, enabling her to do the best work of her life. In 1956, she went on another 2-month trip to America, and she visited the University of California, where she was encouraged to research the polio virus. And she won a grant for this from the United States Public Health Service for £10,000 for 3 years, which is the largest ever grant received at Bergwerk. She began deciphering this virus, which, as you can see, is even more complicated, when it was in a crystalline state. And she continued to publish. I don't know if any of you scientists or academics? No. She published 7 papers in 56, 6 more in 1957. It's a huge amount of work that she's doing, really incredible. This virus, by the way, would later be decoded. She started the work off, which Klug carried on, and he won the Nobel Prize for it later on. And in his speech, he said, Franklin should have been here with me, so he was very different to the rest. In 1958, she built this 5-foot-high model of the tobacco, TMV, for Expo 58, the first international fair after World War II in Brussels. She'd made the prototype in England from tennis balls and plastic bicycle handlebar grips, as that's all they could get hold of at the time. Now, she grew up in an Orthodox family, as I've explained. They kept kosher. They periodically went to synagogue, so British Orthodox. They weren't strictly observant. And with other Jewish girls, she attended separate Jewish prayers at St. Paul's. But she was agnostic and skeptical from a young age. Her family thought that she made a religion out of science. However, she supported Jewish traditions, which she emphasized, such as loyalty to family, and belief in the importance of knowledge, virtue of hard work, values, I suppose. And she told her sister that she was always consciously a Jew. Most of her male friends were Jewish, and her most productive research was done with Jewish male scientists. She didn't suffer overt anti-Semitism at all. She visited Israel in 1953, went to some Orthodox areas, and came away with these views. I find it repulsive that the young should be made grotesque and deliberately isolated from anything resembling a broader life, and forbidden any of the normal subjects in school.
Who's she talking about? Is it
Meir Sharim. So that really from,
Israel?
yeah, the Hasidic peoples. The ones that aren't educated, really, they at least get a secular education. She also visited kibbutzim, by the way, didn't like that at all. She felt that was a lack of individual freedom. In fact, she toured extensively and disliked most of the Jews that she met there. Now, 15 years after the events of the DNA, Watson brought out a book called The Double Helix. And in this, he painted a critical portrait of Franklin. He praised her intellect and scientific acumen, but portrayed her as difficult to work with and careless with her appearance. After introducing her in the book as Rosalind, he wrote that he and his male colleagues usually referred to her sarcastically as Rosie, and she hated this and found it demeaning. She was also nicknamed by them the Dark Lady, in recognition of her bleak moods at King's. Now, in an interview, Francis Crick, the person who he collaborated with at Cambridge, said that he regarded Watson's book as a contemptible pack of damned nonsense. But in reaction, books were written which painted Franklin as a feminist heroine. And it was true that she frequently faced unequal treatment as a scientist, simply because she was a woman. Her salary was lower, even they put it like £5 lower just to prove the point that she wasn't equal. At many scientific meetings, she was the only woman present, and it was hard for her to find challenging work during the war. But her sister, Jennifer, put the story straight in the book that she wrote. She says, the stories of alleged sexism would have embarrassed her almost as much as Watson's account would have upset her. She was never a feminist. Rosalind became a symbol, first of an argumentative swot, then of a downtrodden woman scientist, and finally of a triumphant heroine in a man's world. She was none of these things, and would have hated all of them. She was simply a very good scientist with an ambition to be a fellow of the Royal Society before she was 40. So, I don't know what your views are. I don't think she was a feminist icon. She just wanted to be treated the same as everyone else. So what was she like?
But she did become a fellow of the Royal Society.
She
was 40, didn't she?
She didn't, no, she died before then. Okay, so what was she like? Well, single-minded, forthright, tempestuous, combative, independent. She'd make a good rabbi, wouldn't she? No. She had immense depth. I'm not ridiculous.
Careful, we'll take the book back.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, it's what you want. You want someone like single-minded and, independent. She had immense depths of stamina and worked tirelessly, wasting no time on trivia. By the time she was at King's, she had overcome her uncertainty and her youthful lack of self-confidence. So she was this forceful personality. And so she took after her father as well in having this great sense of morality, of honesty and justice. But she could be abrupt and reserved and suspicious, and her curt manner led to many clashes. She always went straight to the point, was rarely diplomatic. She was a perfectionist, intensely logical, manifestly intelligent, scholarly, diligent, and extremely manually dexterous. Her frankness and honesty created many enemies. She loved to debate openly with others, never letting them get away with a careless statement. She found robust discussions far more stimulating than polite conversation. So this argumentative, abrasive person really could rub people up the wrong way, particularly colleagues such as Wilkins, who sometimes found her unpleasant. His argument, his way of dealing with it, would be to try to give her a box of chocolates. You can imagine the effect of her just giving someone some chocolates. She was fiercely independent, both in her professional and social lives. And I think personality conflicts were the major source of Franklin's issues at King's. and her being a woman made those worse. She took great care over her appearance, had a trim figure, intense dark eyes, as you can see. She dressed with a sophisticated elegance. She loved cooking, was an amusing conversationalist, an attentive hostess. Her friends thought her bright and fascinating and witty and fun, but in the lab, she restrained this lightheartedness and focused exclusively, maybe even obsessively, on her work. She had a strong left-wing conscience, and she initially blamed Churchill for inciting the war. Never tried to hit him with a dog whip, though. Later, she admired him for his speeches. She didn't care about material comforts, often putting up with Spartan surroundings. So long as the work or her trip was interesting, she was fine. This trip in '38 to France, she did give her a lasting love for France and its language. And she considered the French lifestyle to be vastly superior to that of English, who she described as having vacant, stupid faces and childlike complacency. That's just 50 million people written off. As a child, she loved walking, and she holidayed in Wales and Cornwall. She loved strenuous, ideally dangerous holidays. So going to Ukraine now, she'd probably like, wouldn't she? This was her idea of relaxation. She was a very quick walker and rapidly became impatient if she had to wait for others to catch up. One trek she did in the Alps was almost fatal after she slipped off a slope. She often went swimming in lakes or rivers. As a child, she loved to tease, which could be maddening to others. She didn't easily trust people and liked people better when she didn't have to be close to them. She didn't have intimate relationships with anybody, kept her deepest feelings private. Also inhibited, she never kissed her brothers or father and just occasionally pecked her mother. After her younger days, she avoided close relationships with men. A friend tried unsuccessfully to match her to Ralph Miliband, who is the father of David and Ed. Or it was going to become a father. She wasn't married yet. She was enamored with her French mentor, Mary, and he was captivated by her intelligence and beauty, but he already had both a wife and a mistress, so he was already full. Her closest personal relationship was probably this guy, Donald Caspar, who was foreign, very bright, in her field, Jewish, and they had lots of common interests. And she says Caspar was one she might have loved, might have married, an ideal match, but nothing came of it. The girls at St. Paul's were encouraged to be intellectual rather than to settle down and have a family, so that was probably also influential here. In mid-1956, whilst in America, she started to have sharp pains in her lower abdomen, and she found it difficult to zip up her skirt over her bulging stomach. She ignored the pain and carried on working. An operation on the 4th of September revealed 2 cancerous tumours on her ovaries. So this is her grave at Willesden. So this is plot, you can go and see this. And I was just reading out the epitaph. It says, scientists, her research and discoveries on viruses remain of lasting benefit to mankind. Yeah. Newnham named its new graduate block the Rosalind Franklin Building in 1995. In March 2000, King's College in London named the new building the Franklin Wilkins Building. And outside King's in the Strand, there's a panel erected of Rosalind alongside Frederick Denison Maurice, who's the founder of the Working Men's College where her father did it. So they're just trying to get the links. And it was going to be this year, but it's been postponed. In 2024, a robotic rover named Rosalind Franklin will explore Mars. It was supposed to be this year because it was a joint mission between Russia and Europe. And it's just kind of, I just think it's kind of appropriate. Her life was thwarted because of illness and everything. And this has been thwarted because of something else. So that's ironic. So I don't know if anyone's got any questions.
Is her sister still alive?
Her sister is still alive. She is a historian at Cambridge. And through a contact, I spoke with her. And I said, would you be happy to look at this paper? And she said yes. She came back with 3 pages of detailed notes,
Of course.
In the family genes.
which is fantastic.
Yeah.
And I was kind of worried because, and I said, you know, when I said that basically the family repressed its emotions and wasn't able to talk, her comment was, yes, this seems fair. So